The palace had witnessed countless moments that shaped the history of the British monarchy, but every so often, a quiet decision carried more weight than the loudest public announcement. On this particular morning, the atmosphere behind the ancient palace walls felt unusually tense. Staff members moved through the corridors with measured steps, conversations became whispers, and every ringing telephone seemed to signal that something important was unfolding. No official statement had been released, yet speculation was already beginning to spread among royal watchers and journalists gathered outside the gates. Prince William had spent years preparing for greater responsibility. As the heir to the throne, every public appearance, every charitable initiative, and every private meeting was examined in extraordinary detail. Those close to the institution often described him as calm, disciplined, and deeply aware of the monarchy's long-term future. That reputation made today's reports particularly intriguing. According to widespread speculation circulating among commentators, William was considering a significant change in how he intended to approach his future role. While nothing had been confirmed, the mere possibility sparked intense discussion about what the next generation of the monarchy might look like. Inside the palace, senior advisors reviewed schedules and discussed priorities for the months ahead. The royal household had long balanced centuries-old traditions with the expectations of a rapidly changing public. Modern audiences wanted transparency, accountability, and a stronger connection between the royal family and everyday people. Supporters argued that adapting to these expectations was essential for preserving the institution's relevance in the 21st century. Critics, however, questioned how much change could occur without compromising traditions that had defined the monarchy for generations. Observers noted that Prince William had consistently emphasised issues such as mental health, environmental conservation, and support for young people. These themes had become central to many of his public engagements and charitable initiatives. Rather than focusing solely on ceremonial duties, he appeared interested in demonstrating how the monarchy could contribute to modern society through practical action. Whether that approach represented a lasting transformation or simply an evolution of existing royal responsibilities remained a matter of debate. As cameras waited outside the palace gates, media organisations began publishing analyses rather than confirmed reports. Headlines speculated about possible reforms, future responsibilities, and the direction the monarchy might take in the years ahead. Royal experts reminded audiences that many rumours surrounding the family never became reality, and that official announcements should always be distinguished from speculation. Even so, the public fascination with the royal family ensured that every possibility became the subject of widespread conversation. For Prince William, the challenge extended beyond public perception. Any future monarch inherits not only a title, but also centuries of expectations, constitutional responsibilities, and symbolic importance. Every decision is viewed through the lens of history, and even relatively small administrative changes can generate significant public attention. That reality has shaped the experiences of every generation of the royal family, from Queen Elizabeth II to King Charles III, and it will undoubtedly shape William's future as well. Among historians, one recurring question continues to emerge. How does an ancient institution remain meaningful in a rapidly changing world? Some believe the answer lies in preserving tradition as faithfully as possible. Others argue that careful modernisation is the only path toward long-term stability. Prince William often appears positioned between those two perspectives, seeking to respect history while acknowledging contemporary expectations. As daylight faded over London, the palace remained publicly silent. No dramatic announcement arrived, no official confirmation appeared. Yet the absence of immediate news only intensified public curiosity. Sometimes history is not defined by a single speech or headline, but by the gradual evolution of ideas that reshape institutions over many years. Whether Prince William's next major decision ultimately proves historic, or simply another step in the monarchy's ongoing evolution, one thing is certain. The future of the royal family will continue to attract global attention, inspiring debate about tradition, leadership, and the role of the monarchy in the modern era. By the following morning, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had grown even more intense. Reporters filled the streets outside the gates, television crews prepared for live broadcasts, and social media buzzed with endless theories about what Prince William's private meetings could mean. Yet inside the palace, the mood remained calm. No official announcement had been made, and every member of the household understood that speculation often moved much faster than facts. William stood quietly in the palace gardens before his first meeting of the day. He had always believed that leadership required patience rather than haste. The weight of history surrounded every corridor, every portrait, and every room inside the palace. Each reminded him that every generation of the monarchy had faced its own unique challenges. Across London, newspapers debated what the future might hold. Some commentators argued that a younger generation of royals would naturally introduce new priorities. Others believed that preserving tradition should remain the monarchy's highest responsibility. The public followed every headline with growing curiosity, even though no verified information had yet emerged. Inside one of the palace's historic meeting rooms, senior advisors reviewed reports discussing public expectations. The fictional discussions focused on a familiar question: how could an ancient institution remain connected to modern society while preserving the traditions that defined it for centuries? William listened carefully before speaking. "Our greatest strength," he said, "has never been resisting change. It has always been understanding when change serves the people we represent." The room fell silent. Those present recognised that even a simple observation could influence future conversations. Meanwhile, Catherine continued preparing for a series of community engagements scheduled for the following week. Throughout the years, she had consistently emphasised early childhood development, mental health awareness, and family support. In this fictional story, she reminded staff that public service, not palace headlines, should remain the family's central focus. Elsewhere, Princess Anne maintained her reputation for practicality. Rather than becoming distracted by rumours circulating outside palace walls, she encouraged younger members of the household to concentrate on their responsibilities. "Public attention comes and goes," she remarked. "Duty remains." Her words reflected the steady approach that had defined her decades of public service. As the day progressed, journalists noticed an unusual increase in vehicles entering the palace grounds. Without confirmation, online speculation accelerated. Some claimed constitutional discussions were taking place. Others predicted changes to royal responsibilities. Experienced royal correspondents, however, cautioned viewers against drawing conclusions from ordinary palace activity. Late that afternoon, William met privately with several advisors to discuss long-term charitable initiatives. Their fictional conversation centred on expanding opportunities for young people, strengthening environmental projects, and improving collaboration between charitable organisations across the United Kingdom. While none of these discussions represented dramatic constitutional change, they reflected a broader vision of public service for future generations. Outside the palace, photographers waited for any glimpse of senior royals leaving the building. Every vehicle attracted cameras. Every movement became another topic of online discussion. Yet the palace maintained its usual policy of avoiding comment on speculation. As evening approached, William returned to his study, overlooking the palace gardens. He opened several handwritten notes from members of the public, letters expressing hope, concern, and expectations for the future. Reading them reminded him that public trust could never be earned through headlines alone. It required consistency, humility, and years of dedicated service. For a brief moment, the palace grew unusually quiet. Beyond the gates, thousands continued debating what tomorrow might bring. Inside, however, those responsible for the institution understood that meaningful change rarely arrived through dramatic announcements. More often, it emerged gradually through careful planning, thoughtful leadership, and a commitment to serving the public over time. And as the lights of London illuminated the evening sky, one question lingered in the minds of royal observers everywhere. If the next chapter of the monarchy was beginning, what would it ultimately look like? The first rays of morning sunlight stretched across the towering walls of the royal palace of Eldoria, but peace never truly arrived with the dawn. Guards quietly changed shifts while servants prepared the grand halls for another day of ceremonies. To the people gathered outside the palace gates, everything looked ordinary. Inside those ancient walls, however, every senior official understood that the kingdom stood on the edge of a turning point, unlike anything seen in generations. Prince Alexander had spent most of the night studying documents left behind by his late grandfather. They were not ordinary royal records. They contained personal notes, reflections on leadership, and warnings about mistakes that had nearly divided the kingdom decades earlier. Every page carried the same message. A ruler's greatest responsibility was never protecting power, it was protecting the people. As the palace clock struck 8, the Council of the Crown assembled inside the historic Hall of Sovereigns. Marble pillars reached toward a painted ceiling depicting hundreds of years of royal history. Portraits of former kings and queens lined the chamber, silently observing another generation preparing to shape the nation's future. Lord Chancellor Edmund broke the silence. "Your Highness, the Council awaits your guidance." Alexander slowly rose from his chair. "For too long," he began, "our kingdom has measured success by tradition alone. Tradition is important, But tradition without purpose eventually becomes a burden. The council exchanged uncertain glances. Some ministers welcomed those words, others feared them. Princess Eleanor watched quietly from across the chamber. She had served the kingdom for decades and understood that every meaningful reform began with resistance. Change rarely arrived with applause. It arrived through difficult conversations and difficult choices. Outside the palace, rumours continued spreading throughout the capital. Merchants discussed whispers of reform, while newspaper publishers rushed to prepare special editions. Every citizen sensed that history might soon take an unexpected turn. Inside the palace archives, royal historian Marcus Vail uncovered a forgotten journal written by King Theodore nearly 50 years earlier. The final page contained a sentence that immediately caught his attention. "The strongest crown is the one worn with humility." Marcus carefully closed the journal. He knew Prince Alexander needed to read those words before making any final decision. Later that afternoon, Alexander walked alone through the palace garden, where generations of monarchs had reflected during moments of uncertainty. Ancient oak trees shaded winding stone paths, leading toward a quiet lake. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment without advisors, schedules, or cameras. He understood that every decision would satisfy some people while disappointing others. Leadership demanded accepting that reality. Meanwhile, Princess Eleanor met privately with Captain Rowan, commander of the Royal Guard. "Our duty is not protecting a throne," she reminded him. "It is protecting the kingdom." The captain nodded respectfully. Those words had guided generations of soldiers. Across the kingdom, public opinion remained divided. Some believed younger leadership would modernise the monarchy. Others feared centuries of tradition could disappear overnight. Newspapers featured passionate editorials supporting both viewpoints, while citizens debated the future in cafes, town squares, and marketplaces. As evening approached, the council gathered once more. Alexander entered, carrying the journal discovered earlier that day. He placed it carefully on the table before addressing everyone present. "My grandfather believed the crown existed to serve the nation, not the other way around." The room became completely silent. "I intend to honour that belief." No details followed, no dramatic proclamation echoed through the chamber, only a quiet promise that the future would be guided by service rather than status. Outside, church bells rang across the capital as thousands of lights illuminated the palace skyline. Citizens looked toward the towering gates, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Some expected celebration, some expected conflict, others simply hoped that whatever came next would strengthen the kingdom they loved. High above the city, Prince Alexander stood alone on the palace balcony. The streets below shimmered beneath the evening lights. Beyond the palace walls stretched millions of lives that would be affected by decisions made inside these historic halls. For the first time since inheriting the responsibilities of the crown, he felt something unexpected. Not fear, not uncertainty, determination. The chapter that had defined the old kingdom was coming to an end. A new era was about to begin. The morning after Prince Alexander's quiet declaration, the kingdom of Eldoria awoke to an unusual silence. There had been no grand speech from the palace balcony, no official proclamation carried across the capital, and no ceremonial procession through the city's ancient streets. Yet somehow, everyone seemed to know that something had changed. Inside the royal palace, preparations were already underway for a special meeting of the Crown Council. Messengers hurried through the marble corridors, carrying sealed documents, while advisors gathered reports from every province of the kingdom. The atmosphere was calm on the surface, but beneath it lay a growing sense of anticipation. Princess Eleanor arrived before anyone else. Having served 3 monarchs, she understood that the greatest political storms often began in complete silence. She stood beside one of the palace windows overlooking the city, watching merchants open their shops and citizens begin another ordinary day. "It always starts like this," she whispered. "What does?" asked Lord Chancellor Edmund as he entered the chamber. "The beginning of history. It never announces itself." Moments later, Prince Alexander entered the council room. The conversation stopped immediately. He greeted each advisor with quiet respect before taking his seat at the head of the long oak table. "We are not here to protect old habits," Alexander began. "We are here to ask whether those habits still serve the kingdom." Some ministers nodded. Others remained expressionless. For decades, the council had followed the same procedures. Decisions were slow, traditions rarely questioned, and change came only after years of debate. Alexander believed the kingdom deserved leadership that honoured its history while preparing for its future. Far beyond the palace walls, whispers spread through every corner of Eldoria. Travellers arriving from distant towns carried stories of growing optimism. Young citizens spoke excitedly about the possibility of a new era, while older generations urged patience, reminding everyone that lasting change required careful planning rather than dramatic promises. In the palace archives, historian Marcus Vail continued studying journals written by previous rulers. Among dusty shelves and faded manuscripts, he discovered an old map marked with handwritten notes describing projects that had never been completed. Schools, hospitals, bridges, and libraries had once been planned for remote regions of the kingdom but had quietly disappeared from official records decades earlier. Marcus carefully rolled up the map. "This belongs in the future," he said softly. That afternoon, Alexander met with representatives from several charitable foundations. Instead of discussing ceremonies or royal traditions, they spoke about education, medical care, and opportunities for young people living in distant villages. "If the crown wishes to earn respect," Alexander told them, "it must first earn trust." The meeting lasted for hours. No reporters were present, no photographers captured the moment, yet many would later describe it as one of the most important conversations of his early leadership. As evening approached, Princess Eleanor visited the royal library, where shelves filled with centuries of history stretched toward the ceiling. She paused before a portrait of Queen Helena, one of Eldoria's most respected rulers. The inscription beneath the painting read, "Strength is measured not by the power you hold, but by the hope you leave behind." Eleanor smiled. Perhaps history had been offering the same lesson for generations. Across the capital, ordinary people continued their daily routines, unaware of the discussions unfolding inside the palace. Bakers prepared fresh bread before sunrise. Teachers welcomed students into classrooms. Farmers returned from nearby fields with wagons full of grain. These were the people Alexander believed the monarchy existed to serve. That night, the palace rooftop offered a clear view of thousands of lights stretching across the city. Alexander stood alone beneath the stars, reflecting on the responsibilities resting upon his shoulders. Leadership, he realized, was not about commanding attention. It was about making decisions that would still matter long after today's headlines had been forgotten. Behind him, the palace doors opened quietly. Princess Eleanor stepped onto the balcony. "The council will challenge many of your ideas," she said. "I expect them to," Alexander replied. "And if they refuse?" Alexander looked toward the horizon, where the first lights of dawn were beginning to appear. "Then I will convince them, not with fear, but with results." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The kingdom stood at the edge of an uncertain future. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be disagreement, there would be setbacks, there would be moments when even the strongest leaders questioned themselves. But beyond every challenge lay the possibility of building something greater than either of them had imagined. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the palace walls, forces neither of them yet understood had already begun moving, preparing to test not only the future of the crown, but the unity of the entire kingdom. The sunrise over Eldoria carried an unusual stillness, as though the kingdom itself was waiting for something unseen. A cool breeze swept across the palace gardens, rustling the ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of triumphs and tragedies. Within the towering walls of the royal palace, another day of meetings was about to begin. But beneath the routine lay a growing sense that the future was moving faster than anyone had expected. Prince Alexander arrived in the council chamber before dawn. Instead of sitting at the head of the long table, he walked slowly through the room, studying the portraits of the rulers who had come before him. Every face represented a different chapter in the kingdom's history. Some had ruled during times of prosperity, while others had faced wars, famine, and political unrest. Yet every one of them had left behind a lesson. As the council members entered, Alexander noticed the expressions on their faces. Some appeared hopeful, others remained cautious. Change always divided opinion, especially when centuries of tradition were involved. Lord Chancellor Edmund unfolded several reports collected from across the kingdom. "The provinces have responded to your recent discussions," he said. "Many local leaders support greater investment in schools, hospitals, and public infrastructure. Others worry that reform may weaken long-standing institutions." Alexander listened carefully before replying. "Progress should never erase our history," he said. "It should build upon it." The room fell silent once again. Across the palace, historian Marcus Vail continued organising newly discovered records hidden deep within the royal archives. Among stacks of aging journals and sealed correspondence, he uncovered a small wooden chest covered in dust. Its lock had long since rusted away. Inside rested dozens of handwritten letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Each letter had been written by former kings and queens to their successors. Marcus carefully unfolded the oldest document. Its ink had faded with time, but one sentence remained perfectly readable. "A kingdom survives not because its rulers avoid mistakes, but because they possessed the courage to correct them. Marcus immediately realized these writings were more than historical artifacts. They were guides for future leadership. Without hesitation, he carried the letters toward Alexander's private study. Meanwhile, Princess Eleanor visited the Royal Academy, where hundreds of students gathered to hear lectures on history, science, and philosophy. Rather than delivering a formal speech, she chose to walk among the students, listening to their hopes and concerns. One young scholar asked a simple question. "Your Highness, what makes a great ruler?" Eleanor smiled gently. "A ruler who remembers that every decision affects real people, not just history books." The students quietly reflected on her answer. Back inside the palace, Alexander spent the afternoon reading the letters Marcus had discovered. Some described victories that had united the kingdom. Others admitted painful mistakes that previous monarchs hoped future generations would never repeat. One letter captured his attention more than any other. It had been written nearly a century earlier by Queen Helena. "If those who inherit the crown ever choose comfort over service, the kingdom will slowly lose faith, not in its rulers, but in the purpose of the monarchy itself." Alexander closed the letter. Its message echoed many of the thoughts that had shaped his own vision. As evening approached, members of the Royal Council gathered for another private discussion. This time, the conversation focused on long-term plans rather than immediate concerns. Education, healthcare, economic opportunity, support for rural communities. The debates lasted for hours, yet unlike previous meetings, they ended with cautious optimism instead of disagreement. For the first time in years, many advisors believed genuine cooperation might be possible. Outside the palace gates, citizens noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. Palace staff appeared more confident. Community leaders spoke of renewed dialogue with the crown. While no sweeping reforms had yet been announced, people sensed that thoughtful planning was replacing political uncertainty. As darkness settled over the capital, Alexander returned to the palace balcony. The city stretched before him, illuminated by thousands of lanterns flickering beneath the evening sky. He thought about the letters. He thought about the responsibility he had inherited. Most of all, he thought about the generations who would one day judge whether his decisions had strengthened the kingdom or merely delayed its problems. Footsteps echoed behind him. Marcus approached, carrying one final envelope that had remained sealed inside the old chest. "There was one letter I saved until last," he said quietly. It was addressed only to the ruler who would guide Eldoria into its next era. Alexander accepted the envelope without opening it. For several long moments, he simply stared at the royal seal pressed into the aged wax. Whatever message waited inside had survived decades of history to reach this exact moment. He slowly broke the seal. As his eyes scanned the first lines, his expression changed. He looked toward the distant horizon in complete silence. The words inside did not reveal a hidden treasure. They did not expose a conspiracy. Instead, they posed a single question, one that every ruler must eventually answer. When history remembers your reign, what will it remember you for? Alexander folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat. The answer would not be written with words. It would be written by every decision he made from this day forward. The morning sky above Eldoria was unusually grey. Thick clouds rolled slowly across the horizon, casting long shadows over the capital. From the highest tower of the royal palace, the city appeared peaceful. Yet experienced advisors understood that calm appearances often concealed the greatest challenges. Prince Alexander had barely finished reading the final letter from Queen Helena when another messenger hurried into his study. "Your Highness," the young officer said respectfully, "delegates from the northern provinces have arrived. They request an immediate audience." Alexander nodded. "Show them into the council chamber." Within minutes, representatives from the northern territories entered the Grand Hall. Their expressions revealed weeks of exhaustion after travelling hundreds of miles across difficult mountain roads. One of the governors stepped forward. "The northern rivers have changed course after weeks of relentless storms. Several villages have been cut off from the rest of the kingdom. Bridges have collapsed, farms have flooded, and thousands of families urgently need assistance." The chamber became silent. This was not a political debate. This was a humanitarian emergency. Alexander looked around the room. "For years," he said calmly, "our kingdom has promised to protect its people." He paused before continuing. "Today we must prove those promises mean something." Without delay, he instructed the Royal Treasury to release emergency relief funds. Engineers were ordered to inspect damaged roads. Physicians prepared medical caravans, and the Royal Guard began organising supply convoys to reach isolated communities. Princess Eleanor immediately volunteered to oversee the relief mission herself. "If the people are suffering," she declared, "the crown should stand beside them." No one objected. Throughout the palace, activity intensified. Maps covered conference tables as advisors coordinated transportation routes. Stable masters prepared hundreds of horses while blacksmiths worked through the night, repairing wagons destined for the mountains. Historian Marcus Vail watched the preparations quietly. He remembered reading about similar disasters in journals written centuries earlier. Those rulers who acted quickly earned lasting respect. Those who delayed were remembered for their hesitation. Outside the palace, word spread rapidly through the capital. Citizens gathered blankets, food, medicine, and tools. Shopkeepers donated supplies. Farmers offered grain. Builders volunteered their skills. Without being asked, ordinary people joined the effort. Alexander watched from the palace balcony. "The strength of a kingdom," he whispered, "has never belonged to its rulers alone." 3 days later, the first relief convoy reached the mountain villages. The damage was greater than anyone had imagined. Entire bridges had disappeared beneath rushing water. Fields that once produced abundant harvests now lay beneath deep layers of mud and debris. Families waited patiently despite losing homes and possessions. When Princess Eleanor stepped from her carriage, there were no speeches. She simply rolled up her sleeves and began helping distribute supplies. Children smiled for the first time in days. Volunteers worked side by side with soldiers. Doctors treated the injured without pause. The sight inspired everyone present. Back in the capital, newspapers praised the unity shown throughout the kingdom. Editorials spoke less about palace politics and more about the courage displayed by ordinary citizens helping one another. Alexander refused to claim credit. "This is not my achievement," he told the council. "It belongs to every citizen who chose compassion over comfort." His words quickly spread across Eldoria. Weeks passed. Temporary shelters became permanent homes. Collapsed bridges were rebuilt stronger than before. Schools reopened. Markets returned. Slowly, life began to recover. One evening, after visiting the final reconstruction site, Princess Eleanor stood beside Alexander overlooking a newly completed bridge, stretching across the Silver River. "The bridge connects more than 2 riverbanks," she said quietly. "It reconnects hope." Alexander smiled. For generations, kings believed monuments defined their reign. He looked toward the workers packing away their tools. "I think people define it instead." Far away, hidden among the snow-covered peaks beyond the northern frontier, a lone rider observed the kingdom through a brass telescope. He carefully rolled up a map marked with the borders of Eldoria. His destination remained unknown. His purpose remained a mystery. Before disappearing into the mountain mist, he spoke only a single sentence: "The time has come." Back at the palace, no one yet realised that while the kingdom had successfully overcome its first great test, a far greater challenge was already moving toward its borders. The storm they had survived would soon be remembered as only the beginning. Autumn arrived quietly in Eldoria. Golden leaves drifted across the palace gardens, covering the stone pathways that had carried generations of kings, queens, advisors, and soldiers. The kingdom had begun to recover from the devastating floods in the north. Markets were busy once again, children returned to school, and the sound of construction had slowly given way to the ordinary rhythm of daily life. For the first time in months, hope seemed stronger than uncertainty. Yet inside the royal palace, Prince Alexander understood that peace was never permanent. Every ruler inherited not only the victories of the past, but also its unfinished questions. Just after sunrise, the captain of the palace guard entered the council chamber with unusual urgency. "Your Highness," he said, bowing respectfully, "a traveller has arrived from the eastern frontier." Alexander looked up. "A diplomat?" The captain slowly shook his head. "No, Your Highness, he refuses to identify himself." The council exchanged uneasy glances. "And yet," the captain continued, "he carries something bearing the royal seal." Those words immediately transformed the atmosphere. The ancient royal seal was reserved for official state matters. It could not be used without authorization from the crown. Alexander stood. "Bring him in." Moments later, the massive oak doors opened. An elderly traveller entered the chamber. His dark cloak was worn from years of travel, and dust covered his boots. Although his appearance was humble, his posture revealed quiet confidence. He carried a small wooden chest wrapped in faded blue cloth. Without speaking, he placed the chest upon the centre table. "I have travelled for 40 years, the stranger finally said. "This belongs to the crown." No one moved. Princess Eleanor carefully examined the royal emblem carved into the chest. "It is authentic," she whispered. Historian Marcus Vail stepped closer. The craftsmanship matched records dating back nearly 3 centuries. Alexander slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested an ornate silver compass, unlike anything he had ever seen. Its face was engraved with symbols rather than directions. Around its edge appeared a familiar inscription. A kingdom without purpose will lose its way, even beneath the brightest crown. Marcus immediately recognized the phrase. It appears in the oldest royal journals. The stranger nodded. The compass was created for King Aldrin, the founder of modern Eldoria. The council watched in silence. Why has it returned now? Alexander asked. The old traveller smiled gently. Because every generation reaches a moment when it must choose between protecting power or protecting its people. His answer echoed the words Alexander had read in Queen Helena's letters. Coincidence no longer seemed possible. The stranger continued. For centuries, this compass has passed quietly between guardians, chosen not by birth but by character. My duty was never to own it. He looked directly at Alexander. My duty was to deliver it when the kingdom was ready. Marcus carefully examined the artifact. Surprisingly, it contained no magnetic needle. Instead, a crystal rested at its center. It doesn't point north, Marcus observed. The traveller smiled again. It was never designed to. The chamber fell silent. Then what does it point toward? Princess Eleanor asked. The traveller looked toward the palace windows overlooking the city. It points toward the future. No one fully understood his answer. Before further questions could be asked, the elderly man bowed respectfully. My task is complete. Without waiting for permission, he quietly walked toward the palace doors. The guards instinctively moved aside. When they reached the hallway only moments later, the traveller had vanished. Every corridor had been searched. Every entrance remained guarded. No one had seen him leave. Even the palace guards could not explain how he had disappeared. That evening, Alexander carried the silver compass to the highest tower of the palace. The capital stretched beneath him like a sea of golden lights. He carefully placed the compass upon the ancient stone railing. As moonlight touched its crystal center, something unexpected happened. The crystal began to glow with a soft silver light, not brightly, not dramatically, just enough to illuminate the inscription once more. A kingdom without purpose will lose its way. Alexander looked beyond the city toward the distant mountains. For weeks he had believed the kingdom's greatest challenge would come from politics. Now he wondered if history itself had begun calling upon him. Far beyond Eldoria's eastern frontier, another rider crossed an isolated mountain pass beneath the cover of darkness. Unlike merchants or diplomats, this traveller carried no banner, only a black leather journal marked with a faded royal crest. Inside its pages appeared a single unfinished sentence, written generations earlier. When the compass returns to the crown. The rest of the page remained blank. Some stories, it seemed, had been waiting centuries for someone to write their ending.